Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. 10 years ago tonight, news coverage in the area was in the process of dramatically changing. The emphasis in the days ahead would be about survival and then recovery. We'll take a special look about delivering the message when the circumstances were at their worst, but when the message was needed most. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Daryl Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Mark Schlefstein, reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune, and co-author of the book Path of Destruction, The Devastation of New Orleans and the Coming Age of Superstorms. Chris Rose, freelance journalist, and at the time a columnist for The Times-Picayune. He's the author of One Dead in Attic. Dave Cohen, news director, WWL Radio. Welcome to you guys. Thanks for being here to talk about what happened to us 10 years ago. And you all were in the media covering this story. First, I want to ask you, what event really sticks out to you that is media related during this time? Mark, go to you first.
Well, I think the thing that obviously sticks out for me happened on Saturday before the storm, and that was at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I was sitting at my desk in the newsroom looking at a computer model that had been given me by scientists at LSU of what storm surge might do to the city, and it showed basically a Hurricane Betsy flood of the lower Ninth Ward, all of St. Bernard Parish and eastern New Orleans, and pretty significant event, and some other things. The editor and the publisher were behind me, and we were arguing over where this should play in the paper. Should we scare the heck out of our readers like this? And the phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and it was Max Mayfield, the director of the National Hurricane Center. And before I even had a chance to say anything other than, "Hello, Max," he said, "Mark, how high is your building? What kinds of winds can it withstand?" in a voice loud enough that the editors could hear it behind me. And Jim Amos told me afterwards that I turned white, and the argument was over. Yeah. And that was the beginning for us of a recognition of how difficult things were. The irony was that Max really wasn't calling me to give me that warning as such. He was looking for Ray Nagin's phone number so that he could see whether or not Nagin had the message proper. And I explained to him that it looked like Nagin had gotten it and was giving clear messages to the public at that point, and then I said, "I don't have his number, but call the governor's office and she'll get you his number," and that's what happened. And an hour later, Mayfield was on the phone with Nagin, and they had a press conference that evening, and the rest is history.
What was the source of the flow of information about the hurricane? Where were the media getting their information about what was going to happen?
Well, just as with today, a lot of it was coming from the internet with websites, National Hurricane Center website. The forecasts were coming over at that time. They also had a service that would send it to you as an email at that time. And so we were getting the reports as they would come forward from there.
And you guys over at the paper had done, in years before, series and taken a look at the vulnerability of this area.
Right.
What were you thinking when you saw that the storm was approaching us?
Well, it certainly was more than I expected in many ways, and surprising in many ways. In part, it wasn't surprising. I mean, I think we did a pretty good job of explaining what would happen if the city did have a major flood in the series that we did in 2002. But what we got wrong was how the flood would occur, and that series actually was aimed at when the big one comes, and Katrina was not the big one. When a major storm comes and has storm surge that would overtop all the levees, what would it do? It would fill the bowl. And what happened, of course, with Katrina was that you had failures of levees and flood walls that occurred that resulted in the bowl being filled.
So that story you relate, you say that was that Saturday afternoon? Was that?
Saturday afternoon, right.
Before the storm came in. So you get this word from the National Hurricane Center What happens in the newsroom then?
Well, our newsroom already was well underway of getting ready, but basically the word went out to the staff that they should prepare if they were part of the team that was going to be covering the storm to come in and shelter at our building. Many people brought their family members. We had more than 250 people in the building, from newborn babies to elderly in wheelchairs, that ended up having to evacuate 2 days later. And we had teams that were placed throughout the city where they should be. We had people placed with the Army Corps of Engineers at the Superdome that was being used as a refuge of last resort, and in a variety of different other locations.
Quite a story there.
You talk about the big one. By that weekend, I was in central Louisiana, and I always remember the front page of the Alexandria Town Talk, which had a satellite image of the hurricane, and the headline was in big block letters, "This is the big one."
Right, right. And I don't want to underplay the size of the storm, because it was huge, and especially the day before, it was a Category 5, the 175-mile-an-hour winds offshore. But it did drop down in intensity before it did hit. And of course, in our area, the way it hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast, it was the big one. It was a 400-year storm, and it had a storm surge of 28 to 32 feet over there. In our area, the storm surge was not enough to have overtopped the levees on the lakefront or in the canals, and that was where significant flooding occurred.
All right, Mark, we're going to move over to Dave. What's your story?
Well, my most vivid memory, I was on the air when we got confirmation that the canal levees had broken. We had known about the industrial canal, but when we got word specifically about 17th Street at first light, and we knew that those massive sandbags, the size of 18-wheeler trucks they were trying to drop into that hole, just kept disappearing. And it was at that moment when it became so real that the bowl was going to fill. Nothing could stop it. They could not fix the levee breaches. They could not stop the lake from emptying into the city. And we understood from all the briefings beforehand that until the water in the city got to the same level as the water in the lake, it wasn't going to stop. I was on the radio at that time, and I was sitting in the Jefferson Parish Emergency Operations Center, and we had gone back to our downtown studios for a few minutes. They were talking about something, and I remember vividly pushing the button so they could hear me in the studio and saying, "Guys, I know what you're talking about right now you think is very important, but you must come to me immediately." And it was at that moment I realized what we had to do was no longer only inform people and tell them what was happening with the storm, but we had to then, I started begging and pleading with people who had stayed in the city to get out any way they could, because we knew the water was just going to keep rising. All night, the night before, people were calling us saying, "There's some water in my neighborhood, and it's rising. It just keeps rising. The storm's gone. Why is the water still coming up?" And at first light, when we knew that the levees were broken and there was no repairing them, I just remember so vividly just begging and pleading with people, get on the elevated expressways, get on the I-10, get up out of the water and walk as far as you can walk if you have no way to drive. At least get to the convention center. At first, we were telling people to go ahead and cross the river. Then when people started gathering on the West Bank, there was the fire at the mall. Gretna and Jefferson Parish said no one else is crossing the river. Well, then that scared the daylights out of us, because then we knew, wait a minute, the water's still rising. It's not going to stop, and people can't get out of the city anymore. That was the only way out. So it just became, that was the most emotional, memorable part for me, was just going from being a newsman and informing people about what was going on to just pleading and begging with them to do anything they could to tell them the water wasn't going to stop, get out now.
And Dave, eventually all the world's media would cover the story, but for the first 48 hours, it was WWL's story, because that was what everybody had to listen to when they were evacuating, and you all had that $50,000 reach, and so it was really your story to tell during the beginning period.
And that was a great responsibility for us. I mean, it was, from our standpoint, wonderful that our plan worked to stay on the air, that all of the hard work we had done to make sure that we could withstand a major hurricane, that we could continue to broadcast, that had paid off. But then when we realized there's no one to throw papers to because everyone's gone or their homes are flooded, no one was in town to watch television because there was no power or cable. and everyone was evacuated, then other than getting the people who had stayed behind out, our responsibility then was very seriously for that 48 hours was making sure we were constantly sharing accurate information with the people who had evacuated and with those people who had stayed, because we all know there was a lot of inaccurate information that was out there.
And WWL radio really became a lifeline. So you kept sort of in touch with what was going on here, because so many of us were not here, worried about our homes. Let's go over to Chris right now. We'll get back to you to talk about what you all did to gather up your team to continue reporting. Chris, your memories.
Well, it's funny. I didn't realize we were going to start with our pre-Katrina media stories, because you have to understand what I did for a living before August 29th of 2005. The last thing I did for the Times-Picayune before the storm came in is I was out at Fitzgerald's restaurant on the lakefront interviewing Lucy Lawless, the star of Xena the Warrior Princess. That was my job up until August 29th. So my memories before, Mark talked about how we had all the people in place, all the important. I think when the word came down to all non-essential personnel were allowed to leave the city, that was me. So I packed up with my kids and left, because, if Britney Spears and Anne Rice weren't here at the time, there was no need for me to be here. Yeah. That's what I did then. I was a celebrity reporter.
But you became a very different voice.
Well, yeah, things changed on August 30th. So I guess if you want to talk about that moment, where I realized my life had changed and my role at the newspaper was my family and I drifted around for a couple of days, Mississippi and Baton Rouge, ended up there. On Sunday, I loaded my 3 kids and my then wife on an airplane in Baton Rouge. And it was at the Baton Rouge airport, where I had never been before, but I had pictured as probably being a pretty small sort of place, maybe a baggage handler or something. And I got there, and anybody who saw the airport in those days, the visual image to me was that of the amassing of refugees in a sub-Saharan nation trying to flee civil war or pestilence. There were tens of thousands of people there. They'd been there for days, and everybody just had that one bag with them. In most cases, just a plastic shopping bag with whatever it was they owned at that point. And I looked around, and I was trying to make sense of it all. I'd been watching on TV, but not in the city at that point. I still had not come into New Orleans, but it was at that airport loading my family and looking at all these people who were all waiting to leave. And I realized they didn't know where they were going, but they were just going. And it was at that moment I left. I put them on the airport, and I had I didn't even have any paper with me, but I started writing notes on my arm. I looked like that movie back then. The guy's got the tattoos all over him. But I left the airport, and I pulled over in my car, and I wrote an open letter to America called, Dear America, and was sort of, which was an odd thing to do, because I wrote for a local newspaper that wasn't even publishing at the time. But what I hoped would happen happened, and it got carried, it got picked up, ran about 40 newspapers, and went viral. And that was my first story after the storm, and certainly the first story, as they say, of the rest of your life.
The storm you labeled The Thing.
The Thing. That's when I became Chris Rose. One word, not two. A brand.
And stories of politics, stories of just human tragedy, human strength, and a lot of humor in there too. I mean, you kept us laughing as well as crying after, and then those months after. It was pretty poignant.
I think that this is what I said after a while. Here was the destruction of a major American city, and thousands of casualties, and lost homes, and broken dreams, and no hope. And I said, somebody has to tell the jokes about that. So
Also
I was willing to pick up that burden.
Give it a try.
Also remember that you settled some issues, because there was at one point there was a discussion about whether or not Carnival Parade should be held, and you just said, yes.
Yeah.
we need that money.
If I had known, I'd been working at the the Times-Picayune for 25 years before that. If I'd known anybody was going to listen to me when I said stuff like that, I'd have made noise before, but I didn't realize it. I got to decide who was having Carnival. It's up to me. Are we opening the Dome for this? Yeah, and they did it. I'm going, hey, this is great, man.
Well, we're certainly all really glad that you were telling us all that you did in those months after the storm. Errol, let me go over to you right now. What's your most
two
vivid
sets of
memory?
memories from two different mediums. One is this program, which that Friday night, I don't remember who all was on it. I remember it was John McGinnis, and I think Kathy Finn. I don't remember who the third person was. But I remember we finished the show and talking and saying, boy, this was really an upbeat show tonight. I mean, everything we talked about was really positive because that week, the final deals had been signed for Federal City, and Donald Trump had come into town and announced that he was going to build an office tower, and everything we talked about was just really bouncing and good. And I remember saying, boy, now we did know, okay, as we were talking after the show about how great things were, that there was something out there, but it was nothing that we talked about on the show because we just didn't know enough. That was the last show until the next year, the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th. We were off all that time. It was so frustrating. At the most intense news period of time in the city's history, not having the show and not being here. And when we finally came back, this studio on Navarre Street just got ravaged because there was heavy flooding in Lakeview. And so when we finally came back, it was out of the facilities of WLAE, which was in Metairie. And so we did it out of WLA for a few months. And then finally, when the studio was almost ready, it wasn't quite ready, and WLA had the commitments. We did a couple of shows out of a facility that Dillard University has, which is a fine facility. But finally, that 12th night, it was such a good feeling to be back with the show. The other memory is that my main living is with magazines and with New Orleans Magazine, and a monthly magazine is not a necessity in a situation like this. The September issues had just been delivered. They were in people's mailboxes, and so for most people, if they ever saw the September issue, it was probably mush, okay? The October issue for the first, next October will be the magazine's 50th anniversary. One time we missed an issue, and so we missed the October issue. That November issue, we were determined to put out a magazine, and as you point out, we're going to put out a magazine even though there was no mail delivery, there were no people, there were no advertisers, and there was nobody to read the magazine, and we had no copy because all of that was dispersed. Then we're going to put out a magazine, and we did, and it had a picture of the Joan of Arc statue, and now the Renaissance was the cover, and so that was our comeback issue. But what was amazing is how do you put out a magazine when you don't have any advertisers? And one of our partners had, we thought that was a crazy idea. And that was to send a letter to Fortune 500 companies around the country saying, look, we need to put out a magazine. There's no advertisers. Would you buy a one-time full-page ad, camera ready? And I thought, this is nuts. And people rose to the occasion. From around the country, this is a publication's dream to put out a magazine filled with full-page, camera-ready national ads. And we've been good to our promise that we wouldn't ask them again. But that saved us until we could get back again.
Well, you touched on it. We got help from all over the world. I mean, afterwards, when the realization of what happened went out there, we certainly, over those next months and years, really got assistance from all over the world. And we certainly had the national media, international media, descend upon us.
Well, I want to throw one thing in there, because Errol, we were both talking about what we did on our last performances before the storm. And like I said, I was interviewing Lucy Lawless, and it was Xena Warrior Princess. We all know what happened to her since then. Whatever happened to that Trump fella?
Well, he didn't build that tower in downtown New Orleans.
He certainly didn't hear.
Yeah, and we never heard anything about him again.
I look back at the good news of that night. The Trump Tower never happened. Federal City is coming, but it's been a slow process, and it's been a contentious process. But Trump has done the best, I guess, at this point. So.
Okay, I'm going to get back over to Dave, and I sort of touched on it before, is, we had national media coming, international media coming from all over the place. But there at WWL Radio, you were 24/7, and so you had to have people man that microphone for a long time.
Yeah, and that was a challenge. And it was a challenging time for us. David Tyree, who was one of our staple hosts, was fighting cancer. Ended up losing that battle right after the storm. So we had brought Garland Robinette in to fill in for David Tyree. And that proved to be one of the best moves, obviously, we had ever made, because Garland became the voice of the storm for WWL and really for New Orleans. And the call after the storm with Mayor Nagin that ignited the White House to finally get up and do something. But no, it was challenging. And we did bring in news reporters from all around the country. Our parent company was very good to us, and from Kansas City and from New York and from all over the nation, they sent people in. And we had people who were in different roles start assuming the role of becoming the voice of the storm and the voice of WWL. We had rock and roll disc jockeys. We had, top 40 announcers.
And what did you all call yourself at that time? It was like
well,
unified
this was even initially right after the storm. Once our downtown studios were so compromised that it didn't make sense to continue to broadcast from there, because the Superdome roof had literally come through the windows into our building, which is now the Benson Tower, and essentially had destroyed our studios. We did move to Baton Rouge and formed what we called the United Radio Broadcast, where it was radio stations from all over New Orleans and some broadcasters from Baton Rouge that all came together, and we broadcast from there together. And you talk about bringing some crazy combinations of people together. We had sports announcers with country music disc jockeys on the air together doing the updates. Now, we had our news staff still doing all the news reports, but fielding the phone calls, getting us in and out of news, getting us in and out of press conferences, and just talking about the impact of the storm. It was a motley crew.
I remember about 2 or 3 days into it, it was about Tuesday or Wednesday, and I was pulled over in a driveway with relatives in Baton Rouge. We couldn't get anything in the house, so I'd go to my car to find out what's happening in the city. And I'm listening to the most important, vital information of my life from the guy who does the Saturday morning fishing show. And it was an extraordinary.
And that's the way we were getting our
together.
information about what was going on here. No?
We should mention television. This was not television story at the beginning, because they had to relocate and they were broadcast from different places. I mean, eventually they caught up. It was clearly radios at the beginning. But one thing that I saw that I was very impressed with, I don't think anybody notices, again, I was in central Louisiana, and many cable systems around the state were picking up WBRZ in Baton Rouge, which is an ABC affiliate. And Channel 26 in New Orleans was operating out of WBRZ. And so Channel 26's people were on doing the reporting, which was really going statewide, at least south of central Louisiana. And one guy didn't get the credit as there, is Bruce Katz, the weather guy. Because they also had their anchor, and their anchor was some new kid in town who didn't know, Bucktown from the French Quarter. But Katz did. And he was on there, and he was just really essential and did just, I thought, a wonderful job of reporting. And that was what a lot of the state was looking at. When they finally got pictures to look at, they were watching Channel 26's pictures through WBRZ, through the cable system with Bruce Katz and everything.
Well, TV newsrooms definitely needed to figure out how to cover this, and they had needed to relocate. They couldn't be here, as did print.
People were still just getting used to their laptop, though, that people would just, it was the early days of streaming things.
Yeah.
So that was
you need to remember that the Times-Picayune didn't publish print-wise for 3 days, but during that time it was publishing online. And in fact, I listened to you guys as we were driving to Homa in the back of our delivery trucks after we evacuated our building, and wrote a story on the way based on the interviews that you guys were doing, and it was up on the web from the Homa Courier like an hour later. And our online stories had about 8 million viewers a day for the first month. I mean, it's just huge. And that's one of the things that was so frustrating, because you talked about the 17th Street Canal Wall, things like that. Well, I wrote a story about the 17th Street Canal Wall failing at 2 o'clock on Monday, and it was up on the web. We had stories at 9 o'clock in the morning saying that people were on rooftops. And who was reading that? Well, people out who had evacuated and were looking at our website were seeing it, but the people who weren't looking at it were FEMA. And if you looked at Michael Brown's 950 emails from the days after Katrina, you can see he had huge amounts of emails being sent to him from his staff with copies of stories from the national media, and none from the Times-Picayune saying exactly what was really going on.
Just, an incredibly dramatic point in our history, tragic point in our history, and an incredible story for all of you here to cover. And you also, a couple of you all spun off some books also. Real quickly, why don't you just give a quick mention about your books? It's real quick pitch time, because we're running out of time and I want to get something else out.
Well, the reason I have a book, it gets back to, Don Dubuque and Bruce Katz, the Weathercaster, and all the sorts of people who at that moment were just so transformed. I remember, this comes back probably to your first question about the media. I remember being in an uptown house with the Times-Picayune's sports editor, music critic, art critic, and an editorial writer. And at this point, that was it. And I'm realizing this is the battery that the Times-Picayune has in the city at this time covering the story. And it was just a time of involuntary transformation. You just had to do what you do. My book, One Dead in Attic. Yes.
Quite a reaction to it too. A very dramatic book.
Right. Well, I should say this, because my great dirty little secret is I never really wrote a book. I wrote a bunch of newspaper columns. Because that's why people said, well, why don't you, that first book you wrote was so good, why don't you write another? And I go, because here's what I found out, writing a book's really hard.
One Dead in Attic, and the title of yours again?
Ours was Path of Destruction. I was the co-author with John McQuaid, who at the time was our Washington correspondent. And it started at day one, literally, with how the geology of New Orleans affected the way that the levee system was built and what happened during the storm.
Okay, thanks. Now, I want to get from each of you guys grading the media coverage during that time, and you all each have about 5 to 10 seconds to give it a grade.
I give the local media an A, an A+. I think, considering the circumstances, they did a good job. The national media wasn't quite as good because they didn't know who to ask. And a lot of times, if they asked public officials didn't have the right information. But the local media, I give them an A.
Okay. Mark.
Well, I'm going to agree the local media gets an A, absolutely. The national media, many of them paid too much attention to the Superdome and not enough to everything else that was happening. The exceptions were the infamous Brian Williams, who spent a year on the story despite everybody telling him not to do it, and NPR Radio, which also spent a year covering the storm after it left.
Thanks. Chris.
Well, in a time and era where it's easy, convenient, and fun to kick around the Times-Picayune, I'll give us a triple A+. And I was proud to be part of what I think was the most important, fascinating, and best local newspaper in American history during one period of time.
All right, Chris. Thanks, Dave.
No doubt an A for the local media. I think that the preparation and the perseverance, everybody worked like crazy to get the information out there. The problem was the national media that did not send necessarily their A-stringers down, and that when they couldn't get information from officials, reported hearsay from people around the dome or walking down the street, that lots of it proved to be not only wrong, but hideously wrong, and it caused all kinds of problems.
You mean there were not sharks going up Cleary Avenue in Metairie?
No, there were not, and we have to go right now, too. Look, it's been a great discussion. 10 years, it's hard to believe. It'll be with us forever. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.